Okay, welcome back to topic 7.9 in AP US history, the Great Depression. So today we're going to discuss a pivotal turning point in American history that you've all heard of, the Great Depression. So this era marked the end of building prosperity and things were getting better, and the cultural exuberance of the 1920s with the flappers and all the improvements that we've talked about over the last 20 years. And that 1920s era was called the Roaring Twenties. Before that, we had this little blip with World War One. America wasn't too much involved in that. And then before that, we had the Progressive era, and these things ushered in a period of economic prosperity. But now the Great Depression is going to usher in a period of unprecedented economic hardship. Never before this and never after it has there been an economic depression that's as bad as the Great Depression. So, our focus in this lecture is going to be two things. First of all, to understand the causes of the Great Depression and to explore the initial government responses to this crisis. By examining these events, we gain insight into how economic instability reshaped the United States politically, socially, and culturally. So, as we've been learning, the 1920s were a decade of economic growth. But beneath the surface of all that growth, there were significant imbalances that kind of undergirded everything. So while per capita income rose 10% for all Americans, the wealthiest citizens experienced a 75% increase in their incomes. So that's going to create a vast disparity between the rich and the poor. Approximately 70% of Americans were classified as poor, earning less than the minimum $2,500 annually required for a decent standard of living. So the era's economic policies were heavily pro-business with low taxes on corporations and the wealthy. So while these policies were intended to stimulate investment and expansion, particularly Republicans wanted American businesses to be big on the world stage because they thought that America needed to outcompete European powerhouses like Britain and France. So they were intended to stimulate investment and expansion. They disproportionately, though, benefited in the United States the upper classes. And so this idea of America being big on the world stage didn't really benefit the poor as much as you would think it would. So low interest rates and easy access to credit encouraged speculative investments in a couple of different ways. So people were buying these new types of things like refrigerators and washing machines on credit, and they just assumed that because their wages had been rising, their wages would continue to rise and they would be able to afford things in the future that they really couldn't afford now. And then people were even buying stocks on credit. So people were doing these speculative investments, particularly in the stock market, which seemed unstoppable as the Dow Jones Industrial Average increased by 500% between 1921 and 1929. Yet the economy's dependence on consumption had inherent flaws. As consumer goods saturated the market, demand dwindled, meaning as now everybody begins to get a washing machine, not as many people need a washing machine. Nowadays, most people have a washing machine, and people who are buying one are buying one, well, because maybe they bought a new house, right? Or maybe because they're replacing an old one. But before the 1920s, no one had one. And so growth was coming because people were adopting new technology. And so it doesn't make sense that that level of growth is going to continue for very long once the market is saturated. And so there are so many new products that most of the growth is the growth that happens before a product reaches saturation. Okay? So demand then is going to dwindle. That's going to lead to scale back production and job losses. So farmers are going to be hit especially hard. They're facing plummeting crop prices, rising costs, further widening divide between the rural and the urban communities. And I want to go back to people in the stock market doing speculation. And so if you want to take out a loan at a bank, and this is going to be really important to understand because you need to understand why the banks failed, and this is going to be why. So if I want to take out a loan for a business and I go to the bank's going to take a look into my business and they're going to have someone say, well, yeah, it looks like this business is going to produce a profit, and if we invest in it, we'll get our money back with some interest. And so the bank will loan you some money. So what people were doing was they would go to the bank and they say, hey, here's this stock, and I believe this stock is going to go up, and so why don't you give me a loan? And so people would pay 10% down to get the loan, and so maybe they put $1,000 down, and then they buy $10,000 worth of that stock. And if the banks are going to look at this and think that, well, this is a good deal because the Dow Jones went up by 500%, and so we're going to make our money back with interest. And so you have to think about, if there's a stock market crash, what's going to happen? Well, the bank is going to lose all of its money if it's lending out money to people to buy stocks. So why would it lose all the money? Well, if there's a stock market crash, let's say you had a stock that was worth $10 and it goes down to like a penny. And so now the person, they were planning on selling this stock to get money to pay back their loan. They can't sell the stock. It's not worth anything. And when the bank comes to repossess the stock, the person says, well, I don't care. It's not worth anything. And so the bank gets stock that's worthless and does not get paid back. And so now the bank has lent out all of this money, and so it owes, basically the bank's money is all gone, and the people who had money in the bank, they're also going to lose their money for the same reason. And so this is going to be some of the causes of the Great Depression. So let's look at some of the additional problems. So several structural weaknesses contributed to the economy's fragility. One key issue was the lack of diversification. With a few dominant industries, such as automobiles and construction, driving much of the economic growth. This concentration made the economy vulnerable to shocks. So if one of the big industries isn't doing well, then the whole economy is not going to do well. Additionally, antitrust laws at this time are poorly enforced, allowing monopolies to thrive and consolidating power in a few corporations. Another significant issue was the imbalance of purchasing power. While the wealthy engaged in speculative investments, many Americans struggled to afford basic necessities, let alone luxury items. Credit became a way for lower income families to bridge the gap, but it led to widespread overextension and unsustainable debt levels. And what are they buying? They're buying things, again, like washing machines to make life easier at home, refrigerators to keep food for longer, and a lot of the type of household appliances that's going to make life a lot easier. People are going to buy those on credit. Why? Because the economy is great during the 1920s and their wages have been going up, and they think, well, I won't be able to afford this at my current rate that I'm making, but my wages keep on going up, so they're going to go up for the next couple of years, so I'll be making more money in the next couple of years, so I'll be able to afford it. So you can see that people are overextending themselves, and if their wages don't go up, they won't be able to afford it. And if they can't afford it, then the person who gave them the credit, perhaps a bank, or if it's a store, remember the stores are probably, if they're giving credit to a consumer, then they're probably existing on credit from a bank themselves. And so it's ultimately going to go back to a bank. So you have the Fordney-McCumber tariff 1922 is going to make this problem even worse by raising import taxes, which hindered European nations' ability to repay their war debts to the US and slowed the global economic recovery. So, where is all of this heading? So, this is heading to a market crash. And overextension of credit, that's one thing that I talked about. Buying on margin. That's what I talked about when people would go to a bank, the margin, they would just pay 10% to the bank and say, hey, give me a loan to buy $100,000 worth of this stock. I'll give you $10,000 and the stock is going to double in 3 years. I'll pay you back. I'll make lots of money. Everybody will be happy. That was buying on the margin. And so if the stock market crashes, what that means is that the banks are going to run out of money because they lent Joe Schmo all this money and he gave the money to somebody to buy stock and now the stock's worthless. Joe Schmo doesn't have any money to repay the bank, so the bank's out $100,000 or $90,000 because he put $10,000 down. And when they go to repossess the thing that he put up for collateral, which was the stocks, he doesn't care. Joe Schmo doesn't care if you take the stocks because the stocks are worthless. Now, normally, when you go to repossess something like a house or a car, that's something that has value, so the bank can recuperate some of its losses on the lost loan. But with buying on the margin in the stock market, it didn't work that way. And so when the stock market crashes, it's going to cause the banks to fail. So what happened? The crash. The stock market crash of 1929. So that's not the sole cause of the Great Depression, but you can think of it as like that's the first domino that goes down. So leading up to the crash, as I was saying, that speculative investing that was fueled by buying on the margin created an unsustainable bubble. And so when stock values begin to decline, people realize, well, banks have put out all these loans, and so banks are losing all this money, and then people think, oh no, my money is in the bank. And so this bank that's about to fail has all my money in it. I better go get my money out of the bank. And so what you have something that's called a run on banks. So on Black Thursday, October 24th, 1929, nearly 13 million shares were traded as prices plummeting. So this is when the bubble is bursting. The stock market is crashing. Efforts by banks to stabilize the market briefly halted. But Black Thursday, again, that's October 29th, 1929, Black Tuesday of the next week, that's October 29th. So Black Thursday is on October 24th, and Black Tuesday is on October 29th. It's in 1929. That day now is going to see over 16 million shares traded, and that's going to wipe out billions of dollars in wealth. And so by June 1932, the Dow Jones had lost nearly 90% of its value compared to its peak. So the crash frightened both investors and consumers, leading to reduced spending, business closures, and widespread layoffs. So there's actually a lot of, what I would say, different opinions about exactly what caused the stock market, but it's not going to really recover until 1954. So this is now it's going to recover after World War II. People are going to be economic prosperity, but it's not going to fully recover until 1954. Okay, so what are some of the effects of the crash? So the Great Depression's impact was immediate and devastating. By 1933, unemployment reached 15 million people, representing 30% of the workforce. Bank failures wiped out life savings, while businesses faced closures due to declining demand. Homelessness soared as families lost their homes, leading to the creation of makeshift shanty towns, which we'll talk about later. They're going to be called Hoovervilles, named after the president at the time, Herbert Hoover, and these are going to be on the outskirts of cities. Women and African Americans faced unique challenges during this time. While some women retained jobs in teaching and nursing, African Americans were disproportionately affected, often being the first to lose job. The phrase "last hired, first fired" became emblematic of their plight. Many households adopted extreme frugality, growing gardens, mending clothes, and relying on community support like potlucks to make ends meet. The Dust Bowl compounded the economic devastation. So, beginning in 1931, severe drought and poor agricultural practices led to massive dust storms that ravaged the Great Plains. Crops failed, livestock perished, and thousands of farmers faced foreclosure. Approximately 2.5 million people migrated from areas affected, with many heading to California in search of work. These Okies, as they were called because they were from Oklahoma sometimes, often found themselves living in migrant camps and competing for low-paying seasonal jobs. Hostility towards immigrants also grew during this period, with over 400,000 people of Mexican ancestry, many of them U.S. citizens, forcibly deported. Why? One of the reasons is that these people who are forced from the Midwest don't want to compete with non-U.S. citizens for these low-paying jobs. This repatriation program reflected the desperation and xenophobia that the economic crisis exacerbated. Government actions. So the president at the time was Herbert Hoover, and his initial response to the Great Depression focused on volunteerism and limited government interaction. Remember, he is a Republican, and so this goes along with the Republican belief system at this time. He encouraged businesses to maintain employment levels and urged Americans to embrace self-reliance. However, as the crisis deepened, Hoover authorized federal assistance through the Reconstruction Finance Corporation, that's the RFC, and we're going to get a lot of names of these different types of programs throughout the Great Depression, which provided loans to banks and businesses. Despite these efforts, his measures were criticized for being too little, too late. The 1932 presidential election marked a turning point. Franklin Delano Roosevelt, commonly known today as FDR, his landslide victory signaled a shift in public expectations for what? For government to intervene. People felt like they needed the government's help. So he promised something that he called a New Deal, which we're going to look at in detail. FDR's administration would fundamentally redefine the role of the federal government in addressing economic and social issues, and this is a topic we're going to explore in our next lecture. So, in conclusion, the Great Depression was a transformative period in American history, exposing the vulnerabilities of an economy built on imbalanced prosperity and speculative growth. It reshaped the relationship between government and the people, laying the groundwork for modern American liberalism. Understanding these events provides crucial context for the policies and programs that would emerge in the New Deal era, which we'll learn soon.